So good day, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of our TPA series. My name is Busayo Mishotunde. With me today is Frank Brown, the director of the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE, Center for International Private Enterprise. Frank, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on, Busiyama. It's a real honor to be here.
Great. So Frank, tell us a little bit more about yourself, from being a journalist to being a director of the center as you are now. What's your motivation for working on anti-corruption issues and the TPA field in general?
So, yeah, as you pointed out, my career as a journalist took up about the first 20 years of my life. And I spent that working in newspapers in the United States. And then the last 11 years or so, working for various news organizations in Russia, based in Moscow. And that work, that experience led me in many ways to the anti-corruption work I do now, because I witnessed the tremendous human cost that corruption takes in a place like Russia and some of the other former Soviet republics. So it was a natural transition to this subject. And because CIPE focuses in on business-oriented or private sector corruption especially, that was a sort of natural progression for my work as a journalist as well, because in the former Soviet Union, I observed over and over again that people were far more motivated to change by material or monetary incentives, by the prospect of improving their lives, than they were by some sort of appeal to ethical or moral standards or the way things were done elsewhere. So the private sector and the prospect of improving your life through a better job or starting a business was a far more powerful motivator and driver of change. And so the fact that the Center for International Private Enterprise, where I work, is grounded in private sector sensibilities and concerns makes the work to me all the more relevant. Trying to use sort of market drivers to change corrupt behavior. It all sort of fell into place at CIPE for me personally.
Great. So speaking of the work you do at the center, what are the major programs or initiatives you're working on at the center, and how will this impact the TPA field?
So the biggest project we have going in about 20 countries around the world, emerging markets, all of them, has to do with anti-corruption compliance. And the idea there is that companies are required both by local law and by international standards to take a certain approach to anti-corruption and to try to reduce the amount of corruption that their company is involved in. So in very sort of plain terms, the amount of bribes that company employees are giving to government officials. So anti-corruption compliance is very closely aligned with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a US law dating from 1977, which very tightly governs and punishes companies that have a US nexus or some connection to the US when their employees or agents bribe foreign officials. So there are huge fines that are levied and all kinds of reputational damage that comes from violating this Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA. Since 1977, a whole bunch of other countries have put in place similar legislation. And in many ways, this has become the standard for behavior globally. So what CIPE does in these 20 countries where we work is we try to leverage that requirement, that global standard, and the desire by multinationals to adhere to it, their stated desire. Sometimes they adhere to it, sometimes they don't. We try to leverage that in getting local companies to change their behavior and put in place anti-corruption compliance programs. And the whole approach we take with those local companies is to make a business case for them to put in place anti-corruption compliance programs and try to get their employees to engage in less corrupt behavior. We say to them, listen, if you want to join a global value chain, if you want to do business with a multinational, they're going to be looking at your risk profile. They're going to be looking at how you address corruption issues. And if you have a program in place to address the risks that exist in your country, which typically these are high risk corrupt countries, the multinational is more likely to do business with you, and you're more likely to flourish and grow, and all sorts of good things will flow from that. So that's the argument we make in these countries. Most of our programming is around anti-corruption compliance. At CIPE, we have a couple of other programs that are smaller, and sort of just getting off the ground. So one we call integrated compliance. So it's looking not just at corruption risk, but also at labor risk and environmental risk, and how companies can put in place compliance programs that address corruption, labor, and environment all at once, and showing how these different issues are interconnected, that often corruption will enable a company to use forced labor or to violate environmental standards. So we've had a good deal of success working in that area, in the palm oil sector in Indonesia, in timber in Peru, and now we're looking to expand to other markets as well. And the final thing we do is something we call rapid response, which has been around for about 4 years now. And that grew out of our experience in Ukraine, where we watched how very quickly and somewhat unexpectedly, a highly corrupt government was toppled, and anti-corruption reformers came to power, or at least politicians who said they were, committed to anti-corruption efforts. So they came to power, and the international community was quite slow. The sort of large international donors were quite slow to bring support to the non-government organizations on the ground, to the anti-corruption activists, so that those activists could hold this new government accountable. And what happened was you had a vacuum in the period between when the new government came to power with all its commitments to anti-corruption, and when the activists on the ground had enough resources to hold that government accountable. So what our rapid response program does is we look at countries where there's been a recent change in government. For example, the Gambia, Armenia, Sudan. We look at those countries and see what we can do to very quickly support civil society organizations, NGOs that are pushing forward an anti-corruption agenda, so that the momentum is maintained, so governments are held accountable, and so the people of that country are kept laser focused on the issue of corruption. Because in those transition periods, it's so easy to get distracted by other things, such as economic welfare and development and international relations, a whole host of issues. And it's very easy for the new leaders to distract folks from corruption, which ultimately dealing with corruption will dictate the future of that country in terms of how stable it's going to be and how democratic. So those are the things that we work on at CIPE: anti-corruption compliance, integrated compliance with labor and environment, and then rapid response, anti-corruption rapid response.
Good initiatives, I was saying, very laudable too. And so, drawing from your experience as a journalist and someone who has worked on anti-corruption for a very long time, what are the persisting challenges that exist when it comes to tackling corruption in the corridors of power or the civic space? And also, what are the likely potential solutions to these problems?
So that's a very big question. But yeah, it's interesting. I just finished reading a book called Kleptopia by a journalist for the Financial Times named Tom Burgess, and we just recorded a podcast with him. And his book, which I highly recommend, really touches on some of the fundamental issues that allow corruption to flourish and continue to exist globally. And those issues are really, really complicated and difficult to sort of convey to the mass of people in a simple way that's understandable and that can be translated into political reforms that would help fight corruption. So in his book, he's done a fantastic job of sort of putting a human face on things like money laundering and illicit financial flows and kleptocracy, these highly complex transnational issues that perpetuate the system as it exists right now, and the enablers, the lawyers, the consultants, the PR firms that enable kleptocrats to sort of launder their reputations and continue to do damage. And so the point I'm trying to make is that one of the biggest challenges in this fight against corruption is taking these complex ideas and distilling them down to a point where people can support reforms designed to attack these problems. So take, for example, the issue of beneficial ownership. So beneficial ownership, the idea that the owner, the true owner, and the person who benefits from a company's existence is revealed and is public knowledge. That's incredibly important to the fight against corruption. Without that tool, without that knowledge of who actually owns companies, the schemes that enable corruption to occur flourish and go unchecked because it's just so easy to hide that fact. But beneficial ownership is not something that you hear every day about on the street as a sort of political reform or something people talk about or politicians talk about for a bunch of reasons. But that's the kind of issue that we need to attack as a global community if we're going to reduce corruption. So I think one of the biggest challenges for the broader anti-corruption community is to get much, much better at telling these stories and making the connection between issues like beneficial ownership and the well-being of ordinary citizens. Of saying to somebody, if you had beneficial ownership transparency in your country, nurses, for example, fighting COVID-19 could enjoy a 10 or 20% increase in their pay. Or you could hire more medical workers or teachers, but there will be a tangible benefit to the people of your country if you address this fundamental corruption issue. And we're not very good at this point at telling that story and making those connections. And that, to me, is what needs to happen in the years to come. That's a top priority.
Good. That's a very, very good response. And I think I would like was to work more on it, like many organizations, not only CIPE as well. What will you do if you would turn back the hands of time to the time when you start working on anti-corruption? What will you do differently, or what would be your recommendation for anyone who is passionate about working on anti-corruption to actually do some of these solutions, these potential solutions you've mentioned?
So my advice to my younger self and to folks just starting out would be the same, is get some technical expertise, whether you get training to be a forensic accountant or perhaps an attorney, or studying government procurement, but go into the weeds, dig into the technical details that may not be all that exciting on the face of them, but are absolutely essential if we're going to be serious about not just sort of pontificating about the problem and writing, editorials about how terrible things are and exposing, over the top sort of kleptocrats with fantastic mansions and fancy cars, and isn't that terrible in very poor countries. So getting beyond that and actually digging into the mechanics of corruption and the technical details and being able to talk about those, because without attacking those issues, change won't come. And many of us, I speak for myself, lack that expertise and lack those fundamental tools. So if I could go back in time, get more education, that's what I would do.
Good. But then also on the flip side, not everybody can work on anti-corruption issues, but we all have a role to play. So for those people who are not technically in the field, what will be your advice or recommendation for how they can support people who are working in the field of anti-corruption?
I would say if you have the time and energy to get involved politically and be an activist, do that. And spend the time to write letters and go to protests with an eye towards what damage corruption does. Because the protest may not be about corruption, but it may ultimately be shaped by it. And your political action, being involved somehow politically, can help change the situation. But a lot of people don't have that luxury. They have families to support or take care of, and they don't have the time or the sort of personality suited to that. So then I would just say, when you vote, be very, very aware of who you're voting for and why, and what that person's financial ties are, and what sort of hidden or unspoken connections they may have to corrupt figures in your country. That'd be my advice.
Awesome. So finally, we are curious. This is a fun question for people who know you or people who want to get to know you more. So what is that thing that will surprise anyone about you, Frank?
So this is a very difficult question, because I don't want to reveal something that could get me in hot water. So I suppose, so when I was younger and putting myself through university, I drove a truck. I was in the Teamsters Union, which at that time was highly corrupt. But it made me, that experience of being in the Teamsters Union and being a truck driver, really sensitized me to the importance, the value of unions, and how important it is for individual workers to be able to collectively organize and speak as one voice. But it also taught me a lot about transparency and democracy within organizations like that, and how easy it is for people to be manipulated. In this case, the other truck drivers, the folks who worked in the warehouse, manipulated in a way that allowed them to vote against their own self-interest. So that experience at a very young age of being in the Teamsters Union, of witnessing corruption, corruption in an institution that was absolutely vital for people to be able to speak up without being punished by their employer, that really left a lasting impression on me. Yeah.
Great. On that note, we'll call it a day on with our interview. Thank you so much, Frank, for sharing your experience as a journalist, as an expert in anti-corruption, and also on the work that you are doing at CIPE. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Busayame. Thank you.